Hello everybody, this is the second lecture for climate change and today we're going to cover LOB. We're going to look at the consequences of excessive greenhouse gas emissions on our environment as well as our living organisms. Okay, one of the first major consequence of excessive greenhouse emissions and global warming is the melting of our polar ice caps. Okay, polar ice caps refers to all the land ice and sea ice that are located at our poles. All right, so there's evidence that our Arctic pole glaciers and ice caps have been in decline. Now, glaciers are something a little bit different. I will tell you more about glaciers later on. Okay, so there's evidence that our Arctic glaciers and ice caps have been in decline. In September 1984, NASA satellite images shows the size of our Arctic ice cap is this big, and in September 2016, the size has evidently shrunk. And recent studies of our glaciers in the Alaska has also indicated an accelerated rate of melting. Furthermore, local warming over Greenland is likely to be thrice the global average and can eventually lead to a virtual complete melting, leading to a sea level rise of about 7 meters. This is indeed very scary. Now, the melting of polar ice caps is an example of positive feedback in global warming. What is positive feedback? It is a process that occurs in a feedback loop which exacerbates the effects of a small disturbance. So, it is a case whereby A will produce more of B, which will in turn produce more of A. So the melting of polar ice caps will cause a positive feedback in global warming. What do I mean? You see, global warming will cause our ice to melt. And when there is less ice remaining on the surface of our planet, there's less reflective surface to reflect the solar radiation back into space. So this will lead to increased global temperatures, meaning this will lead to an increase in global warming. Thereby, the melting of polar ice caps causes the positive feedback in global warming. Now, so this has an after effect, and that is the rising of sea levels. Okay, as all of that land ice melts, okay, they will go into the sea. And as water expands and take up more space than ice, shallow coastal regions especially will be flooded. Okay, there will be increased risk of flooding. This may increase salinity of bays and estuaries and possibly upset ecosystems. Okay, because seawater, all right, has a lot of salt in it. So seawater is high in salinity, right? So with excessive flooding of shallow coastal regions by seawater, there will be increase in salinity of bays and estuaries. Okay. Coastal lowlands and delta ecosystems will also be affected. Right, for instance, wetlands will be forced further inland, okay, because of the flooding of coastal regions, and the incidence of coastal floods will increase. Okay, and if you're wondering what are estuaries and bays and deltas, okay, so I'm going to pause here to explain to you. So this here, what you see here is an estuary. Okay, it is a partly enclosed body of water along the coast where one or more streams of the river enter and mix with fresh water and seawater. So at an estuary, this is basically where the river meets the ocean, and in this region there is a mix of fresh water and seawater. Okay, then what's a bay? This is a bay. It is a body of water partially enclosed by land that is directly open or connected to the ocean. Alright, so all these things is just for your further knowledge so that the content that you're learning for climate change will make a bit more sense for you. Okay, and what is a delta? Okay, a delta is when is an area whereby sediments accumulate in at the mouth of the river. So a delta is a landform created by the deposition of sediments that is carried by a river as it's the flow of it leaves its mouth and enter a slower moving or stagnant water. Okay, so deltas may form at estuaries. Okay, so where all these sediments accumulate at estuaries, then this formation is now called a delta. Okay, all right. So the rising of sea level is not a problem unique to other coastal regions. Okay, we Singapore, being an island country, is also facing the imminent danger of rising sea level, and we are already starting to prepare for it. So, for instance, there's this expressway called Nicole Drive along the coast of Changi. Okay, we have already begun works to elevate the height of this expressway. Okay, because it's just right next to the sea. Now, the next effect of increased greenhouse emissions is the melting of permafrost. And before I go on further, I have to explain to you what is latitude and altitude. Okay, now latitude is the angular distance of a place north or south from the Earth's equator. Okay, and I will let you know later that permafrost, most of it is found in our northern latitudes. Okay, so latitude is the angular distance of a place north or south from the equator. Please do not mix this up with altitude. Altitude is the height of an object or a point in relation to the sea level. Okay, so please do not confuse latitude with altitude. So, as I said earlier, permafrost is found mainly in at regions of high latitudes. So, in our northern atmosphere, especially. Okay, so and what is permafrost? Permafrost is permanently frozen soil, and 24% of our land in the northern hemisphere is actually comprised of permafrost, which stores massive amounts of carbon. And so when temperatures rise due to global warming, okay, because of the excessive greenhouse effect, permafrost is at risk of melting. This means the organic matter that is found within the permafrost will decompose, releasing the stored carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and methane. Now, the melting of permafrost has also other bad consequences. It can also cause land erosion, the disappearance of lakes, landslides, and ground subsidence. It can also cause changes in plant species composition at high latitudes, all right, because of the organic matter and the nutrients that it contains. So it can also potentially disrupt ecosystems. Now, peat is made up of dead organic material. It is also rich in carbon. It consists of 90% of water and 10% of plant matter. It is also mostly found at high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, both at the surface and below. Okay, but peat is also actually very common in tropical lands as well. All right. For instance, the soil in Indonesia is largely made up of peat as well, containing a lot of dead organic material rich in carbon. So that is why when forest fires happen in Indonesia, it's quite difficult to extinguish them because the peat in those forested areas are the ones that are burning. They're very rich in carbon, so they burn very well, and it's very difficult to extinguish peat fires. Okay, nonetheless, peat is mostly found at the high latitudes of our northern hemisphere. They can be found at both on the surface or below, and some of this peat is actually found underneath the permafrost layer. So the melting of permafrost will also release the carbon stored of the peat. Okay, and a study found that just simply the 1 degree Celsius warming of the earth over the next few decades could lead to 38 to 100 million tons of carbon released per year from peat alone. So let's take a look at this video. Okay, we will wait for a while for it to load to understand more about permafrost.
It may not look like it, but underneath all this Arctic snow is a potential climate change catastrophe. This is permafrost, soil that stays frozen all year round, and you can see inside how it's packed with minerals, decaying plants, and ice. Researchers from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and other institutions are pulling permafrost cores like this one out of the ground in Barrow, Alaska. Permafrost covers nearly a quarter of the landmass in the northern hemisphere, and all those dead plants amount to a huge amount of carbon trapped in the soil. It's almost 200 times what we humans pump into the atmosphere each year. So what happens to all that carbon if a warming climate causes the permafrost to thaw? Scientists are throwing every conceivable piece of scientific hardware at one small patch of permafrost to study it in incredible detail. They want to know exactly what's buried inside. How much ice, what kinds of materials and bacteria, and how will it all react as global temperatures continue to rise? They're repurposing a CT scanner, an instrument normally used to diagnose disease in people. We're traveling down the length of the core, starting with the part closest to the surface. This is called the active layer. It thaws every spring and then freezes again in the fall. Now we're moving into the actual permafrost. This soil may have been frozen for 10,000 years or longer. So what if that starts to change? When permafrost thaws, the bacteria inside spring to life. They start eating the dead plants. And as they eat, they release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane that trap heat in the atmosphere. And what worries scientists is that as the climate warms, more and more of the permafrost will thaw. Carbon that's been locked in the soil for millennia may be released in a very short amount of time, trapping more heat in the atmosphere. This could be a catastrophic feedback loop. But it could be more complicated than that. What if the extra carbon dioxide makes more plants grow at the surface, and the extra plants actually absorb some of that carbon released when the permafrost thaws? This sounds like a subtle distinction, but it could have a huge impact on the fate of our planet. The goal of this research is to know what we're headed for. Some of the answers may lie in this chunk of icy Earth.
Okay, right. So now let's look at the effect of increased greenhouse gas emissions and human activities on the stress on freshwater supplies. Okay, first of all, do you know that only about 3% of Earth's water is fresh? The remaining 97% is actually found in our oceans, right? And out of this 3%, 99% of it is inaccessible. 69% is locked up in glaciers and ground ice, and 30% is in the form of groundwater, which is mostly inaccessible. So that leaves us with only less than 1% of water that is more easily accessed, which is in the lakes and the rivers. Now, so it is projected that many countries and many people around the world that by 2040 they are going to experience water stress. So this is how increased greenhouse gas emissions and global warming further reduces our freshwater supplies. First of all, the intense heat will cause excessive water evaporation in many areas, and so many reservoirs and aquifers around the world will dry up. Global warming will also alter precipitation patterns and hydrological systems. I will explain this in the next part. Okay, so it means that many areas around the world will experience prolonged droughts. Okay, and this further exacerbates the stress on fresh water supplies. Now, this is when I talk about glaciers. Okay, glaciers are actually made up of fallen snow that over the years have compressed into large, thickened ice masses. Okay, they actually grow and they actually move slowly. All right, and they are actually a source of fresh water. Okay, in the summer they will melt, so meltwater from glaciers will actually supply fresh water to villages and towns that are downstream to these glaciers. So people living in arid climates near mountains often rely on glacial melt for part of the year. And since global warming will cause glaciers to shrink worldwide, this reduces meltwater supplies for these villages and towns. Now, at high latitudes, there are some predictions that rainfall in high latitudes will intensify in the coming years. However, this does not necessarily translate to good water quality. In fact, it is projected that climate change will reduce the water quality in these areas. Okay, why? Because increased temperatures will make it more difficult for oxygen to dissolve in water. So this water will have less dissolved oxygen concentration, thereby reducing its quality. And the increased heat will also increase algae blooms. Okay, meaning an explosion in the growth of algae in the water. So this also compromises the water quality. Now, and climate change is predicted to cause heavier rains and more intense rainfalls and more frequent heavy rains in certain areas. Okay, and this will increase the levels of sediments, nutrients, and pollutants that will be found in our water sources. All right, and to areas that are prone to flooding due to climate change, okay, the water treatment facilities may be compromised as well, further compromising the quality of water. So all this adds stress to our fresh water supplies. Okay, so in other words, heavy overconsumption coupled with poor rainfall because of climate change, okay, have ravaged our water resources and devastated agricultural output in countries worldwide. Okay, for instance, in South Asia, in areas such as Bangladesh, there have been massive losses of groundwater, which has been pumped up with reckless lack of control over the past decade, largely for land irrigation for agriculture. Next, global warming will also cause more heat waves and heavy rains. Okay, what are heat waves? Heat waves are prolonged periods of unusually hot weather, at least 5 degrees Celsius greater than the average daily minimum. Okay, and they have the greatest impacts during summer months. Right, and the impact is worsened when it is accompanied with high humidity. I already explained to you about the combined effects of high humidity and increased temperatures in our previous lecture. So the problem with high humidity is that it doesn't allow our sweat to evaporate. So our body cannot get rid of our latent heat by sweating. So this actually stresses our body more, and it can create lethal conditions for us. So due to increased global warming, we will experience more heat waves, more frequent heat waves that will last longer, okay, as well as heavy rains that will be more frequent and last longer. So this will have serious consequences for our ecosystems, can kill, injure crops, livestock, and even us. So we have evidence for this as well. Heat waves used to happen once every 3 years, but is now happening once every 200 days. Okay, and a small increase in global temperature will lead to a dramatic change in the frequency of extreme events. For instance, 1 in 5 extreme rain events has already been experienced globally as a result of that mere zero point 0.8 degrees Celsius global rise in temperature since the Industrial Revolution. Remember, I told you this may look like a small number, but its effects is actually tremendous. Okay, so in a normal climate, the probability of extreme events can be visualized in a traditional bell curve. Okay, so extreme weather event should be at the extreme ends of this bell curve. So what climate change has done is that it has shifted the curve to the hotter side. Okay, increasing the average. Okay, and created more frequent bouts of hot weather. Now, how exactly does increased greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, how does it actually create more heat waves and heavier rains? Now, when due to global warming, when warm air floats up, okay, they will hold a lot of moisture. And when this warm air that hold moisture, when they meet cool air, the moisture will condense into water droplets. And when the water droplets are big enough, they fall down as rain. I believe all of you are familiar with how rain is formed. Okay, but intense and prolonged warming over one region may lead to increased evaporation of water and droughts. Okay, so let's say, right, there's intense warming in this area, leading to an increase of evaporation of water in this area. A lot of water evaporate, and then it will be carried away by the currents to move to another location. So there isn't enough rainfall over here, so this place may go into drought. So when that warm air travels from this region to another region and meet cooler air, they will precipitate and dump heavy rain onto it. Okay, so this is how we can create heat waves in one region and then heavier rains in other regions. Okay, so do we have evidence for this? Yes, global warming has indeed led to heavier rains and more occurrences of flooding all around the world. Okay, this is because warmer air holds more moisture, so they will lead to more intense rainfall. Okay, and the return period of extreme rain events has decreased from 50 years to 30 years. Okay, this is data taken from the Gulf. Okay, in mid-August, they were comparing the data in 1900 to present day. So they noted that the average number of years between intense rainfall, okay, has decreased from 50 years to uh, 30 years. So there has been an increased frequency of extreme rain events. On top of that, the intensity of the rain, They are measuring the typical 3-day heavy rain total in inches, and they noticed that the intensity of the extreme rain events has also increased by 10%. So with that, I have covered the environmental consequences of excessive greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, we first looked at the melting of polar ice caps, followed by the rise in sea levels. Okay, and then we looked at the effects of on the thawing of permafrost. Okay, and then after that we looked at the stress on freshwater supplies, and lastly the increased frequency and intensity of heat waves and heavy rains. In the next part of this lecture, I will tell you more about the impacts on living organisms such as our coral reefs, as well as our fishes and insects. So I'll talk to you soon in the next part.